In this conversation with Julian Schvinderlman, we will summarize 5 previous talks we have since October 7, 2023, about Israel and its external conflicts. Julian is an international political analyst, writer, and lecturer. He holds a bachelor's degree in administration from the University of Buenos Aires and a master's degree in social science from the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. The previous conversations are in Spanish and are listed in this slide. They are all part of the cycle Conversations with Sebastian Galliani in this YouTube channel. Hi, Julian, how are you?
Hi, Sebastian. Very well, and you?
Very well too, very well too. Happy to talk to you again, and given the high repercussion that our previous talks in Spanish have, I think it's a good idea to try to summarize them in English.
I'm glad to hear that and happy to do so.
Well, great. Let's then start. So in our previous conversations, we talk about the 3 circles of conflicts for Israel. So I would like to start this talk by summarizing them and then go into more detail on each one.
Sure. I think that the, let's say, Palestinian, Arab, and Islamic Israeli conflict can be categorized in such a way. In a way, it responds to a geographical as well as to a conceptual position, meaning that if you focus your eyes only on the Palestine-Israel issue, then of course you'll have to pay attention to the Palestinian areas that are disputed by Israelis and Palestinians, Jerusalem, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip, for example. So if you only pay attention to that, you can talk about a Palestinian-Israeli conflict. And then you'll have to deal with Palestinian nationalism since the time of Amin al-Husseini as the most prominent political and religious personality at the time, and until nowadays, basically. Now, if you expand a little bit, both geographically and conceptually, you deal with what was originally considered this conflict and defined for decades as the Arab-Israeli conflict. And that would involve the wider, mostly Sunni Arab world, from Morocco to the Levant, essentially, and parts of Africa, where you might consider nations at war with Israel historically, such as Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, Egypt, Libya, and many others. And then if you go beyond the Middle East to the wider region of the non-Arab Muslim world, then you'll have to take into account countries such as Turkey, Iran, Pakistan, Indonesia, Azerbaijan, which are Muslim non-Arab nations that out of solidarity concerns were also part of this conflict, especially defined in this case in religious terms or parameters. Because it is hard to understand, for instance, why a country like Iran, which is 1,500 kilometers away from Israel, that doesn't even share a border, may have a conflict with Israel, to the point where they claim for Israel's destruction, to the extent that they are building a clandestine nuclear program with a clear military dimension, with a purpose, among others, of attacking Israel in such a destructive fashion. So one usually takes for granted this fact, but we shouldn't. And we have to make a pause and ask this question. Why a nation that is so distant, that doesn't share a border with Israel, may have a conflict with Israel, may even want to destroy it? So that, I think, helps to understand that the Palestine-Israel issue or the Arab-Israel issue also has a Muslim, Jewish, Muslim-Israeli angle that has to be addressed. And it is best explained in religious terms as the radical elements within Islam, not all of Islam, but the radical elements within Islam understand them. So in this sense, and summing up, I think that it is important then to make this distinction of three circles, which help us understand in geographical terms and conceptually the three main areas or worlds, so to say, that Israel contends with.
Perfect. Hence, then, let's dig into detail on each of them. Let's start with the first circle, the conflict between Judaism and Islam.
Okay. Well, this is clearly a religious matter, essentially, which dates back to the times of the Prophet Muhammad, when he originally establishes the new faith, the third monotheistic faith after Judaism and Christianity. He makes an attempt to engage theologically the Jews of Medina, and they, in a sense, reject him. Actually, they don't buy the argument, and they prefer to remain as Jews. This is the point when Muhammad incorporates into what later will be the Quran, the most sacred Muslim text, some hostility against the Jews. And the problem with this is that they coexist with positive comments about the Jews, but by making sure that this is part of the Quran, which is a theological text, a sacrosanct book that cannot be disputed by Muslims, only revered, the problem of Muslim anti-Semitism emerges because it in a way, it was perpetuated and rubricated religiously. So part of the problem with the hostility of Islam towards Judaism lies in the fact that the Prophet himself made sure to include elements of hostility and bad characterizations of the Jews in the Quran itself. And of course, later scribes also worked on those issues, and they created what is called the Hadith, which is sayings and actions and deeds, let's say, of Muhammad that are part also of the main elements of this Muslim faith. So that's very problematic, and it's, in my view, the basis of Muslim theological hostility towards the Jews. Now, throughout the years, of course, there were variations where, for instance, in different countries or different areas, different rulers would apply different rules to the Jews. And some were more benign than others, some were more hostile than others. But essentially, this is due to the so-called Sharia, the Muslim Islamic law, which had different applicability depending on the context and the moment. But the problem is that many modern Muslim nations today can claim that the Quran itself and their prophet had bad views about the Jews, and this is explained as a justification for attacking or showing disrespect for the Jewish state, the state of Israel.
Right. So let's then move to the second circle, which is about the Israeli-Arab conflict. And let's just divide this into two periods. Let's first discuss the period from, let's say, from the first Aliyah at the end of the 19th century to the creation of the state of Israel, and then we talk after that period.
Sure. Well, first of all, there's a phenomenon called political Zionism, which emerges in the second half of the 19th century. This is a movement that claims for the political independence of the Jews, and it is based on a wide variety of ideas, even different ideologies that coexisted within this movement. You had a right-wing outlook, a left-wing outlook, a religious outlook, a secular outlook. And it's very interesting and very important, in fact, to pay attention to this myriad of political and religious viewpoints, because it gives you an idea of how rich Zionism was, political Zionism, in terms of its essence, let's say. So why did it emerge, and why did it chose to go to Israel/Palestine? I think that's maybe a good starting point to understanding this movement. during the second half of the 19th century, we have to divide into two different geographical areas. On the one hand, the Jews of Western Europe, and on the other hand, the Jews of Eastern Europe. The Jews who were living in, for example, Poland, Ukraine, Russia, they were having really a bad time. They were persecuted, they were exposed to pogroms, they were attacked, they were massacred, they were expelled. So they had a sense of urgency in terms of solving their situation vis-a-vis the Gentile world at the time there. On the other hand, you had the more emancipated and assimilated and integrated Jews into Western European societies, where in fact they were not exposed to persecution or assassinations and stuff like that, very physical hostility like in Eastern Europe, but they did endure some sort of discrimination, legally, academically, socially, politically, and even culturally. You have to recall, for instance, the incident of Captain Alfred Dreyfus in France, where this prominent, well-off Jew, who was pretty much part of French society, in fact, he was a captain, was falsely accused of being a German spy. He was stripped of his condecorations and he was expelled from the army, judged in a phony trial, and condemned to a penal colony far away in the Indian Ocean. Eventually, it became clear that this had been a strong injustice, that in fact there had been a plot by the French army itself to undo part of the French Revolution and its promise of equality, liberty, and liberty, equality, and I'm missing some, and brothership, no? That the revolution proposed, that it had to include the Jews. But this led to a cultural shock, a psychological shock to those Jews who were integrated into the Western European realm, amongst them people like Theodor Herzl, Max Nordau, and many others, who questioned whether the Jew was ever going to be integrated, truly accepted, fully accepted into European society. And that led them to a conclusion which was very logical and very rational, by which they said the only way to normalize the relationship between Jew and non-Jew, it's only if the Jews would have a state of their own, very much like the Poles do, and the French do, and the Germans do, and the Italians do. It was no longer a matter of religious identity per se, but actually of nationality. And of course, they considered that the place to realize Jewish political sovereignty was in the land of Israel, a land that had been historically intimately connected between the Jewish people and this land, that even has biblical roots of connection and of history. And indeed, the whole Judeo-Christian Western civilization rests upon these beliefs, these shared beliefs. So that's when political Zionism emerges, and it gains strength afterwards when, in a context of, let's say, gathering nationalisms and world wars, essentially gains legitimacy and the support of the international community to precisely create this Jewish national home in their ancestral land that is called at this time Palestine, you know? Thing is that once the Jews begin to move en masse to Israel/Palestine under the so-called British Mandate, which was created by the League of Nations at the time, with a purpose for Britain to facilitate the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. And later the UN would recommend creating two states, one Jewish and one Arab. Those were the precise terms of the partition resolution of 1947. At that time, well, the Jews began to build a state, and they finally declared their independence in 1947. But the Palestinians and I mean the Palestinian leadership when I say this, and the Arab leadership at the time, they were deeply hostile to the notion of having a Jewish state in the Middle East. And this, Sebastian, you have to recall that there were no Arab nations at the time. There were no Arab states. This is a moment when the Middle East was simply a colonial spillover of wars, and the colonial powers begin to attribute land and power and political independence to many nations. And this is a context where all the Arab world, as we know it today, emerges.
And,
Libya, Egypt, Saudi
and,
Arabia, Iraq, and so on. Yes.
and the main colonial powers are Britain and France.
Exactly. So essentially, these powers begin to decolonize the region, to withdraw from the area, and they gave way to local landlords, especially in the Arab realm, that eventually become rulers of future nation states.
Mhm.
If you take a look actually at the map of Jordan, for example, you can see that it's being drawn with pencil. I mean, it doesn't look like an accidental natural geographical shape. It looks like it's been drawn at the maps of colonial officers, and indeed it was. So what needs to be understood is that Israel was established in a context in which many Arab nations were also established. The great difference is that in the case of the Jews, they had to fight simultaneously both the colonial powers and the local opposition to the establishment of a Jewish state, which is related to the previous circle of analysis. The fact that historically the Jews have been a minority in the realm of Islam, Dar al-Islam as is known, and centuries later, they gained independence and became a majority in a Jewish state where the Muslim became a minority. Now, from the point of view of theological Muslim history, some considered this quite offensive.
Mm.
Especially the radical elements within Islam and the Arab world, they thought that it was just a theological contradiction that a people that had been condemned by Muhammad and were a minority tolerated by the Muslim rulers throughout centuries. And when I say tolerated, it's quote unquote, of course, no? Tolerated means not in terms of tolerance as we understand it today, but back then, which was a different concept and notion of tolerance. Well, then this is, I think, another element that explains the psychological and theological hostility, not just political or territorial hostility on the part of the Arab Muslim world to the establishment of the State of Israel. So basically, that's what essentially happened. The Aliyot, the mass emigration of Jews under the auspices of the British as a colonial power, and later receiving a seal of approval legally from the United Nations through the resolution 181 that proposed the partition of Palestine into a Jewish and an Arab state, more or less explains this first part of the establishment of Israel from political Zionism onwards.
Now, this the United Nations proposal of the two states is accepted by Israel and is rejected by the Arab leaders. In the same way, like the proposal coming from the Peel Commission was also accepted by the Jewish leaders, but not by the Arab leaders, right? What I want to say is that from the beginning, the Jews always accepted the proposal that the international community offer in terms of the division of the land between Israel and Palestine. And it was in both cases the Arab leaders that rejected.
Absolutely. And you're right in pointing out the Peel Commission, because that's the moment that marks the first precedent when there is a proposal of territorial compromise between Arabs and Jews, and the Jews accept it and the Arabs reject it. And that set the tone and the pattern for future territorial compromises. Basically, the Jewish people and the Israelis later will accept different forms of partition and coexistence based on territorial compromise, and for the most part, Arabs and Palestinians will not. There are exceptions, of course. Jordan and the peace agreement with Jordan, and Egypt and its peace agreement with Israel, and much later the Abraham Accords, that I'm sure we'll be discussing them much later. But in terms of the Palestine Arab circle, one of the circles of analysis that we are presenting here, the Palestinians have not.
Right. I guess we can talk now, right? We can sort of say, okay, now let's move from the state of Israel is created, the proposal of the United Nations is rejected, and essentially there is a war in which Israel is attacked by 5 Arab countries that for Israel is called the War of Independence. For the Palestinian, it's called the Nakba. From there to the Abraham Accords, right? There is a whole history of starting with this large war between Israel and 5 Arab countries, and then, as you were mentioning before, peace agreements with certain countries, first Egypt, then Jordan, and then the Abraham Accords, and how essentially this conflict has been reduced to the essentially conflict with Palestine.
Absolutely. If you consider let's say, the numbers, for example, you'll notice that the Arabs gradually came to accept Israel's existence after failing to eradicate it in numerous wars. For example, in 1947/48, they attacked Israel, 5 countries, and they lost the war. That's when in 1949 the war ends and Israel is still alive. The major following war is in 1967, when Israel preemptively attacks 3 nations that had publicly declared they are going to attack Israel and expel the Jews into the sea. That's Jordan, Syria, and Egypt, and they lose the war. Then you have the Yom Kippur War in 1973, when Syria and Egypt attack Israel in its most sacred religious day. They take it by surprise, but however, Israel manages to turn the war back and prevail. So that's 2 countries attacking Israel. And then the very last major Arab-Israeli war takes place in the early 90s, when Saddam Hussein from Iraq, a country that doesn't even share a border with Israel, attacks it due to political considerations. In fact, he wanted to break a coalition that the United States had put together, combining Western and Arab countries to fight off Iraq invasion of Kuwait. So the progression is descendant, and very clearly, from 5 nations in 1948 to 3 in 1967 to 2 in 1973 to just 1 in 1990/91. So the Arab world gradually came to accept Israel's existence. There were peace agreements, as I mentioned before, with Egypt and Jordan, and much later with Sudan and United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco as well, with the Abraham Accords. So clearly the Arab world, the Sunni Arab world, understands that Israel is here to stay. And there are a few, of course, extremist elements, the Shiite component of Islam within these societies, the fundamentalists who oppose Israel's existence, and maybe psychologically the masses in the Arab world still struggling with the notion. But the political leadership seems to have came to terms with the idea of accepting and even cooperating with a Jewish state. Now, the Muslim world is a different story, because you have countries, for example, like Turkey, that used to be a good ally of Israel, especially in the military realm, until a quarter of a century ago, when Recep Tayyip Erdogan, the new ruler in Ankara, he's pretty hostile to Jews and Israelis, so he changed policy. But you also have countries such as Azerbaijan, a Shia Muslim nation that is allied to Israel.
Mm.
You have Iran, a Shia Muslim nation which is deeply hostile to Israel. You have Indonesia, the largest Muslim country in the world, which of course, like Pakistan, is not friendly to Israel. But then you have other nations in the Muslim world which you never hear of them being part of any agitation against the Jewish state. So as you say correctly, the Palestine/Israeli conflict is what remains at center place in terms of a persistent irresolution of this conflict.
And I think it's important to sort of recount the from the Nakba or the War of Independence, the relation in terms of territory and sovereignty of the conflict between Israel and Palestine. Because a lot of people think that somehow Israel occupied the Palestine territories because Israel decided to do it in a let's say colonialist way, which is not true. So essentially, so why don't we go back to the wars of independence, which Israel won, but it is not Israel that occupies the Palestine territories. So exactly how that happened.
Absolutely. Well, first of all, we need to point out to a historical fact that is usually overlooked. There never has been a Palestinian state in Palestine or the land of Israel.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, the people who lived in the so-called Palestine area under the British mandate, which included current-day Jordan, for example, the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and Israel per se, and Jerusalem, they were called Palestinians. The Jerusalem Post, for example, an Israeli newspaper, the commercial name was Palestine Post at the beginning. The current Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra used to be called the Palestine Symphony Orchestra.
Mm-hmm.
The Bank Leumi, an Israeli bank, a Zionist bank, if you will, was called Palestine Bank, LTD. So essentially, everyone who was living in Palestine was called a Palestinian, irrespective of his or her religion, to the point that I think it was in the 70s, Golda Meir, at the time Prime Minister, said, "We are all Palestinians," when she was emphatically rejecting the notion of a separate Palestinian people from the Arab world. Now, whether Golda Meir was right or wrong, it's a different question that I don't want to go into that now. Only I bring it as an example of the fact that how Israelis perceive themselves, that they knew that as Jewish Palestinians, they were a part of the British Palestine mandate. Now, after the war, what happens is that the Gaza Strip stays in the hands of Egypt, and the West Bank, or Judea and Samaria in biblical terms, stays in the hands of Jordan. During about 20 years, from 1949 to 1967, until the Six-Day War, the Egyptians and the Jordanians, they never granted political independence to the Palestinians.
Mm-hmm.
Nor did the Palestinians requested such independence. There was no political agitation for a separate Palestinian state from Jordan or Egypt at no point in history in that period. And that has to do with the fact that they perceive themselves as part of the Arab world. Even the refugees, the so-called Palestinian refugees of 1948, of the War of Independence, or the Nakba, as they call it, the catastrophe, as is translated, they were perceived and see themselves as part of the Arab societies, and they actually pressed for integration into those societies. The Jordanians did accept them, and extended citizenship to these Palestinian refugees, to the point that now Jordan is half Palestinian at the very least, and half Arab tribal, let's say. But Egypt never did, Lebanon never did, Syria never did. And that led to the refugee Palestinian issue, which lasted forever, basically. Now, so it's important to understand that when these very sensitive pieces of land, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, were controlled by Arab powers, they did not even consider the possibility of granting independence to the Palestinians because they just regarded them as part of the Arab world, and the Palestinians themselves view themselves as such. After 67, when Israel conquers these areas, and of course, quite a few million Palestinians begin to be ruled by Israelis, then they develop a separate Palestinian identity, which of course nowadays exists, and it constitutes the modern Palestinian people. And this is when they begin, actually coincidentally, to establish a political and terrorist and guerrilla organization called the Palestine Liberation Organization at the end of the 1968, after the Six-Day War, with the purpose of destroying Israel, but doing so under the umbrella of a specific Palestinian cause. But the PLO, Sebastian, was established originally in 1964 by Gamal Abdel Nasser, when actually they still controlled these territories. And they did so as an instrument of warfare against Israel. Only much later, after the Six-Day War, the PLO opted by Yasser Arafat and his colleagues, let's say, and then in the context of an emerging separate Palestinian identity, the PLO gains importance globally.
So, and there start a period of conflict, right? Increasing conflict that ends up in the Intifada, which then led to the Oslo Accords. So what I want is to delve into more detail about the Oslo Accords and the failure of Camp David and Taba, which I think were likely the last opportunities for a two-state solution as envisioned since the beginning of the conflict between the Jews and the Palestinians.
Yes, absolutely. Well, the Oslo Accords take place in a very specific context. We have to recap a little bit of history here. The PLO was established in 1964, as I said, but it gained notoriety in the late 60s and early 70s after Yasser Arafat, Mahmoud Abbas, the current Palestinian president, took the leadership. And they began an international campaign of terror against Jewish and Israeli targets, and of course also against European interests and particularly American interests as well worldwide. But they did establish the Palestinian cause as a global issue by attacking, for example, Israelis at the Munich Olympics in 1972, by hijacking planes, which by definition was an international problem, by hijacking boats, for example, I mean cruceros, cruises, no, you say in English, big ships that carry tourists, by attacking embassies, by attacking international airports. So essentially they created this urgency, this idea that the Palestinian cause existed and required a resolution. That on the one hand. On the other part, there's the matter of history itself. As the decades progress, as history evolves, the Soviet Union collapsed. And as it collapsed, the PLO lost its main political and financial patron, that was Moscow. And a few years later, they will lose the Arab world because the PLO sided with Saddam Hussein when he invaded Kuwait. That was a financial patron of the PLO, together with Saudi Arabia and many other Gulf countries and other countries in the wider Arab world. As a result, at the beginning of the 90s, the PLO found itself isolated politically and restricted financially. It was still a rich organization, And in fact, it was very rich, in fact, but it had these restrictions, these constraints, especially politically. This is when Yasser Arafat decides to sign on to the Oslo Accords. And you have also to recall that after the First Lebanon War in 1982, the PLO had been expelled from Lebanon, initially created a base for itself in Jordan, and was expelled by the Jordanians in the so-called Black September month of 1970. They moved to Lebanon, where they were expelled by the Israelis to Tunisia, where they settled. So they were far away from Palestine. At the beginning of the 1990s, there was no Palestine state. There was no Palestine cause, essentially, that generated much interest anywhere, except for a phenomenon that's the Intifada, which of course put the issue center stage on international concerns and media attention. But politically speaking, the PLO had lost its war with Israel. And at this very moment of political isolation, financial deterioration, and ideological, actually, exhaustion, let's say, this is when the Israelis offered the PLO this branch of olive, no? How is this sign of peace in order to rescue itself from oblivion and be able to be a part of a peace process with the Israelis, leading to an eventual peace. Now, on the part of the Israelis, the situation it's also interesting to consider. At the time, there had been an international peace conference when Israel was ruled by the Likud, which is a right-wing party, the center-right. Yitzhak Shamir was the prime minister of Israel at the time. But this Madrid conference that it had the auspices of Washington, led nowhere. And then there was a domestic election in Israel that was won by a center-left party, the Labor Party, that was led by Yitzhak Rabin and Shimon Peres. And they had gained power in a party platform calling for peace with the Palestinians, among other issues. And in this context, there was a clandestine secret channel of communication between some academics in Israel and PLO figures that was mediated by the Norwegians. That's why it's called the Oslo Accord, because most of the negotiations took place in Norway, in the outskirts of Oslo, its capital. And eventually this led to an accord, which was rather unique in the history of political agreements, because it was not set as a foreign policy goal by Israel, but actually was brought to the leadership by intellectuals and academics that were interested in having some kind of engagement with the Palestinians. But at the end of the road, Yitzhak Rabin signed this accord with Yasser Arafat under the auspices of President Bill Clinton of the United States. And the Oslo Accords were born. And this created a whole new epoch for Israeli-Palestinian relations.
But eventually these accords were going to end up into a two-state solution. And even without much cooperation from the PLO during the process, in which terrorist attacks on Israel intensified, creating a lot of stress within the Israeli society. The Israeli government keeps going with the peace process and get to Camp David meetings with an offer that was essentially very similar to the original United Nations proposals. And this was rejected by Arafat. And then President Clinton tries to save the process. He was heavily invested. It was one of his legacies. and called to a final meeting in Taba, where he also offered some international financial support to help with the building of the Palestine state, and again is rejected, which essentially led to the second Intifada, uh, which was extremely more violent in terms of the terrorist attacks against the Israel civil population. This in this in the current context and in the political campaign, it was Bill Clinton that appeared and said, "Look, I mean, there's a lot of young people that talks about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict without knowing the history, and in particular without knowing that the Palestinian could have had the two-state that in principle they claim if they would have agreed to this agreement." And essentially he really said very clearly, that was a once in a lifetime opportunity, and it was lost.
Yes, absolutely. The pattern that we began discussing a few moments ago when we mentioned the Peel Commission and the partition plan, and then we didn't mention, but we could have mentioned the Land for Peace formula of 1967 that the Arab world rejected as well. It did create a pattern where on the Palestine-Israel matters led to this constant rejection and missing opportunities of having an independent state of their own. In fact, in 2000, as you correctly pointed out, Bill Clinton had heavily invested politically and emotionally and economically on establishing a Palestinian state at peace with Israel, and Yasser Arafat rejected an offer that included unprecedented concessions on the part of Israel, such as the totality of the Gaza Strip, 97 to 98% of the land of the West Bank, with the compensation of land from other parts of Israel where there were a strong Arab demographic presence, sharing Jerusalem, allowing Arafat to have his political office even in the area near the Temple Mount or there, and also allowing for a symbolic return of refugees. That's something that Israel had historically opposed because it threatens its own demographic integrity. But Arafat rejected this, and not only he rejected this, he went back to Ramallah and launched a second intifada, which was, as you mentioned as well, very violent. It cost thousands of lives on both sides. Both people suffered a lot due to this decision that was based on intransigence. And then at Taba, when Ehud Olmert was ruling in Israel and Mahmoud Abbas in the Palestinian areas, again, there was a very, very generous offer on the part of Israel, basically respecting these very same terms. And Abbas didn't even bother to reply. So actually, the offer went nowhere. The Palestinian state was never established. And as a result, they're still lacking a state of their own. They could have had it many, many, many times. I recall a phrase by the late Fuad Ajami, a prominent Arab thinker who was an American academic, who actually said it's hard to fathom this, to consider a people that receives the rarest of gifts from history, second opportunities. But they kept on ignoring them, and they are famous. They are famously called as the people who never misses to miss an opportunity, never misses the opportunity to miss an opportunity. So essentially, yes, history is there to prove this. Unfortunately, they did not have the wisdom and the flexibility politically and psychologically to accept the idea of coexisting with Israel, as the Sunni Arab world did indeed went through that process and signed many peace agreements with Israel. But unfortunately, the Palestinians in the current form, in the current leadership, I don't think there is a chance for that. You really need a new generation of Palestinian leaders to be able to reach true peace with Israelis.
Yeah, and unfortunately, the second Intifada creates a shift in the Israeli society, demanding a solution to terrorism, basically, and that opened to the later period, in which probably there was never again an opportunity to, I mean, achieve a two-state solution like the one that was missed in Camp David and Taba. You mentioned the issue of the refugees. So let me go back to the War of Independence, or what the Palestinians call Nakba. Uh, uh, because essentially it's at that point where this problem is created. Of course, this would have never happened if the United Nations proposal for the two-state would have been accepted. But let's put that aside. What I want to discuss now is that it is really the UNRWA, which is an organism with a United Nations that's created only to handle the issue of the Palestinian refugees, that made this problem unsurmountable, really.
Absolutely. First of all, we need to recall that there were two distinct refugee issues at the time. On the one hand, the Palestinian refugee problem that was a result of the Arab aggression against Israel, and on the other hand, the progressive expulsion of Jewish population in the Arab world from the 1940s up to the 1960s and 70s. To the extent that today there barely is a Jewish community in any Arab country.
Mm-hmm.
And this is a result of a deliberate policy of actually creating the conditions of forced displacement. This is a clear case of ethnic cleansing. There had been very, very culturally rich Jewish communities in the Arab world throughout centuries. And now there's basically not a single Jew in the Arab world in any major Arab country. So this is something that one has to consider. Now, in terms of what happened in the Palestinian-Israeli specificality in the context of the wider Arab-Israeli war, is that about 700,000 Palestinians either left, according to Israel, or were expelled, according to the Palestinian narrative, from this piece of land. Now, I can tell you that there was clearly no policy of expulsion on the part of the Israeli leadership. And the proof of this is the current Arab minority in Israel, which constitutes more than 20% of the Israeli population. And they are the descendants of those Arabs who stayed in the new-born state of Israel, that actually accepted the invitation by David Ben-Gurion, the prime minister at the time, of staying within the borders of the new Jewish state, where he said this state is also going to be a state for yourselves, where you can develop culturally and socially and religiously and so on. Now, of course, now this Arab minority has some inequalities vis-a-vis the Jewish population, but also you can say that it's being fully integrated. There have been Arabs who are members of the Supreme Court of Israel, of academia, both as teachers and lecturers and students. There has been Miss Israel, who was an Arab, and so on and so on. But the problem was with what happened with the many Arabs who actually decided to leave the area and went to Jordan, Egypt, Lebanon, and Syria mostly, and to a wider Palestinian diaspora in Europe and even in Latin America and other parts of the world. Well, they were never allowed to return, not to Gaza, not to the West Bank, and much later not to the State of Israel per se. The Israelis regard this issue with great sensitivity because of demographics. At the time, as you said, a specially designated United Nations agency was created, UNRWA, for dealing particularly with the refugees of this war. And the mandate that UNRWA had was fashioned in such a twisted way that they ended up perpetuating the conflict of the refugees instead of solving this matter.
Mhm.
At the beginning, there were, as I said, a few 100,000 refugees of Palestine origin, and now there are over 5 to 6 million Palestinian refugees. So one has to question, how is this possible? Not with the passage of time, a refugee population tends to disappear, not to grow exponentially.
Mhm.
And this is because this UN agency defined as refugee not only the original refugees of this war, but all their descendants, their future generations as well. So if you are a Palestinian who are living in London, but your parents were considered refugees at the time, then you are also considered a refugee, even though you enjoy citizenship of other country. So this is very problematic. The United Nations, in this respect, perpetuated the problem and aggravated the problem. In the recent October 7th massacre perpetrated by Hamas, we saw that even officials from UNRWA participated in the attack. So the moral deterioration of this organization is absolute. That's why Israel has just, so to say, prohibited. This is not the proper word to use, but this is what they did. They decided that they will no longer engage with UNRWA in the area when it comes to protecting the rights of the Palestinians, not the rights, the human rights, I mean, of the
Yeah,
Palestinian.
and for example, Sweden just decided that it's not going to contribute anymore to its funding, and I think the United States will do the same under President Trump.
Absolutely, but also the General Assembly has just passed a resolution asking the International Court of Justice to determine whether there is any legal basis to Israel's decision not to engage anymore with UNRWA in the areas it operates. So it's an incessant war against Israel on the legal and political and even at the warfare level. But basically, the problem of the Palestinian refugees is that they were never integrated into the Arab countries, and they were kept deliberately as pawns to be used in the political campaign of the Arabs against the Israeli state. Sadly, you still today have Palestinian refugees. They are still living in squalid camps, and it's very sad. And if you contrast this with what happened with the Jews expelled from Arab countries, you don't hear of a Jewish refugee problem from 48 or 49 because they were integrated into Israeli society or into other nations.
In our previous conversations, one thing that we discussed at length is how both the United Nations and the ICC have become anti-Israel, which you just mentioned, and often using international law as a lawfare against Israel. And I would like you to elaborate on this. Maybe you can use the Goldstone report as an example.
Sure. There's something called Lawfare, which is a composure of two words from law and warfare, meaning that you can use the law, an international law, especially international public law, to attack your enemy. And in this sense, Israel became a clear example of lawfare internationally when, for example, the Goldstone report was issued, or with the current arrest warrant orders by the ICC against the Prime Minister and Defense Minister of Israel, or when, as I just mentioned, the International Court of Justice is considering for example, whether Israel has a right to disconnect from UNRWA or not, or whether it is committing a genocide against the Palestinians, as South Africa has been asking the court to make an opinion about it, to issue an opinion about it. Now, the Goldstone report is one of the most clear examples of this lawfare matter, when a judge, a Jewish judge from South Africa who had an international renown, was invited by the United Nations to investigate the situation and the Israeli policy vis-a-vis the Palestinians. And he issued a report that bears his name, is known as the Richard Goldstone report, when he said actually a lot of falsehoods and baseless accusations against Israel, especially saying that Israel committed war crimes, crimes against humanity, that it was an apartheid state, and so on and so forth. It was a very damning report that the author himself, a few years later, rejected. He actually published 2 articles in the Washington Post, especially with the first one, which was the most important, and a second one in the New York Times sometime later, when he completely disavowed his own conclusions. And he began one of these articles by saying, had I known then what I know now, the Goldstone report would have been totally different. But the damage was already done, and unfortunately Israel had lost the media battle once more against a determined enemy that never tires of resorting to any sort of tool to attack it, be that militarily, politically, in the realm of public relations, or even twisting the law to fit its own political agenda.
Okay, let's move on to the current situation. Behind the current conflicts of Israel with terrorist groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, Iraqi militias, stands Iran, which finances these groups and advances its nuclear program with the objective of destroying the state of Israel and its population. Thus, it can be said that the true enemy of peace in the Middle East is the fundamentalist Iranian regime. This is perceived by the wealthy Sunni Arab countries, which have shifted from viewing Israel as an enemy to seeing it as a crucial ally for achieving peace and economic development in the region. In this context, the most significant peace agreement in the history of the region between Saudi Arabia and Israel was about to be reached when Hamas carried out its pogrom on October 7, 2023. So my question is this: did Israel have the right to destroy Hamas? And why was that the appropriate response?
Okay, yes, of course Israel had a right to destroy Hamas because Hamas is a jihadist movement with the determination to destroy the state of Israel. And it has declared so actually in its own charter of 1988, when it says explicitly that it wants to eradicate the Jewish state from the Muslim land of Palestine, as they understand it. They even are fanatically anti-Jewish to the extent that they accuse the Jews of being responsible for the 2 world wars and the French Revolution and the Bolshevik Revolution. They are extremely conspiracy-minded. So Hamas is a very serious, it used to be at least, a very serious Shiite terrorist movement. It also was a political force in Palestinian politics, and it had been controlling and ruling the Gaza Strip for quite a long time, nearly 2 decades, after Israel left the area in 2005. No? And then a couple of years later, they actually won elections and then expelled the Palestinian Authority from the area. Now, the thing is that on October the 7th, 2023, Hamas launched a devastating attack. It took Israel by surprise, and it committed the fiercest pogrom in the history of the area and the most serious attack on Jews since the Holocaust. And it was the worst terrorist attack in the history of modern Israel. So it actually, the psychological impact for Israeli society and for the Jewish diaspora was really, really serious. Israel had to respond and had a right to respond. And in fact, I would argue it had a duty to respond. On the one hand, because it is connected to something we discussed before pertaining to political Zionism. The idea of establishing a refuge for the Jewish people that was exposed to pogroms and attacks in the diaspora in the second half of the 19th century led to the idea that if the Jews had a state of their own that can protect them, they will be safe and the relationship with the non-Jews would be normalized. But what if I tell you that on October 7th, 2023, the most dangerous place to be for a Jew was actually the state of Israel? That's what happened. So essentially, on a cosmical level, on a very meta-historical consideration, it was imperative for Israel to regain the confidence of its own citizenships, its own Jewish population mostly that had been attacked, to once more believe in the viability of the Zionist idea, that Israel is indeed the national home and a refuge for the Jews. So on the one hand, this is a reason why Israel had to respond to this attack. On the other hand, of course, the immediate legitimate right to react to an act of aggression of this proportion, very much like the United States responded to Al-Qaeda after 9/11. And in proportion, in comparative terms, this was devastating for Israel. It was like many 9/11s. If you make a comparison of the numbers vis-a-vis the general population, victims versus general population. And of course, 9/11 stands in its own category of spectacular evil. But I'm saying only that to convey the gravity of how Israelis experienced this. Now, so Israel had a duty to respond, and they responded, in a very correct fashion, I believe, because no other army in the history of modern warfare has achieved this performance of, let's say, killing one civilian, roughly speaking, per combatant that they had eliminated. For example, the Hamas claimed essentially that Israel killed over 40-something thousand Palestinians. These are figures that are totally unverifiable. They do not distinguish between civilians and Hamas combatants or Islamic Jihad combatants. They don't take into account the fact that their own rockets have misfired and killed Palestinians themselves. They don't consider natural deaths, with people keep on dying of natural causes during war even. So essentially they are inflating these numbers. And a recent report by the Henry Jackson Society in London has established for good how inflated these figures are by Hamas. Now, on the other hand, Israel said that it killed over 1,800,000 Hamas combatants and Palestinian Islamic Jihad combatants. So basically, roughly speaking, we are talking of one civilian killed per each combatant killed. Now, no army in the world has performed this way in any context, much less in such a challenging context as Gaza is, where you have a subterranean network of tunnels which is longer than the New York subway system or the Buenos Aires subway system or the London subway system, for example, where the Hamas fighters use the civilian population as human shields, where they fired from mosques and UN buildings and even cemeteries, and where they were actually stealing, the food, the humanitarian assistance that the world and Israel were giving them. So this was an extremely complex scenario, and Israel somehow managed to decapitate its leadership, especially Yahya Sinwar, Ismail Hani, and many others, it was able to reduce Hamas to a guerrilla force fighting Israeli soldiers in Gaza. And actually, it is a shadow of what it used to be. And it did so by preserving Palestinian civilian lives to the greater extent possible. And just to give you some, let's say, some figures that speak of what Israel did during this campaign to protect Palestinian civilians, I think it's worth considering the following. Israel sent 6 million pre-recorded calls to Palestinians, warning them that they were going to attack in certain areas so they would move out. They sent 4 million text messages. They made 20,000 phone calls and dropped 1.5 million leaflets from the air to the Gazan population to warn them to move away from areas intended to attack. It set up over 15 field hospitals. It sent or allowed in over 51,000 trucks carrying over 700,000 tons of food, which meant more than 3,000 calories a day per Palestinian woman, man, and child. It coordinated with the United Nations a polio vaccination campaign in Gaza that reached basically the entirety of the population. And even today, it continues to provide fuel and electricity to an entity which is a hostile entity. So I don't see any other example that I can think of a nation that was attacked from a territory controlled by a fundamentalist movement bent on its destruction that is taking these humanitarian considerations towards the civilian population of a hostile entity. And let me quote Sean Spencer, who actually he served for 25 years as an infantryman, and he served in Iraq 2 times, and he holds a degree in urban warfare studies at the Modern Warfare Institute at West Point, where he actually teaches. And he wrote a column for Newsweek in March that I would like to quote. He said, "In my long career, studying and advising on urban warfare for the US military, I have never known an institution to go to such great lengths to care for the civilian population of the enemy country, especially while simultaneously fighting in the same buildings. In fact, according to my analysis, Israel has implemented more precautions to prevent harm to civilians than any other force in history, far exceeding that international law requires and more than the United States did in its wars in Iraq and Afghanistan." Now, so this is important because this is a military expert who is based his opinion on his own research and in his own experience as a military man. So I think it is very important to understand something here, and I would like to sum up this point with this. This is a war that was imposed on Israel. Israel did not choose this war. Israel had vacated the Gaza Strip nearly 20 years ago. It was a fundamentalist movement that violated Israeli territorial integrity, and it kidnapped some of its cities, actually 251 citizens, and it committed abhorrent acts of aggression, raping and burning people alive, and actually beheading some soldiers also. So that Israel would react in such a humanitarian fashion while facing such a monstrous enemy committed to its destruction, I think that it speaks a lot about Israel's army moral quality, irrespective of how the media portrays this, irrespective of how the United Nations wants to portray this. And actually, it's important to understand that this really is.
And even a significant group of the population within Israel is very critical of how the government, and this is strange because they like to blame only Netanyahu when a whole organization is involved, right? And so that's a logical a logical mistake that they make when they make this argument.
Well, absolutely. But I mean, this speaks of Israeli democracy and the plurality of views that inhabit its political ecosystem.
Right. Right.
You don't find that on the other side of the border.
Hmm. Anyway, I think this is a very important point because it's obviously, I mean, it's needless to say that no one deserves war, suffering, and death, but it's part of reality, right? Countries, as we discussed, have to defend when attacked or threat. So it's important to know that it essentially is done with this level of morality.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. It's important to bear this in mind, especially when you see countries such as France lecturing Israel or Scandinavian nations that have never been remotely exposed to something like this. Unfortunately, many nations that have never even endured the slightest menace or even war uh, take this pontifical, so to say, attitude of lecturing Israel constantly. But I mean, if Israel were committing war crimes, I think they would have a point, but it is not. And not only it is not, it is actually making the greatest effort in history, in the history of warfare, not to do that.
Now, regarding the need of Israel to respond to Hamas that you explained, I would like to add the following, right? So, in terms of if we think about that, here there is a peace process, right? And this peace process, as we discussed in this talk, has been progressing over decades, and the Abraham Accords are a very important part, and in particular, an agreement, a peace agreement between Israel and Saudi Arabia is a game changer in the region. Those accords are the result of all these Arab leaders realizing that Israel is not an aggressive country, but a country when they can cooperate, but also that they share an enemy, which is the fundamentalist Iranian regime. Okay, so in that sense, given that Israel was surprised by Hamas, Israel needed also to regain the confidence of all these countries to continue this peace process.
Absolutely. Yes, if you think of what forces pushed for the Abraham Accords, you have to consider what you are saying, which is that the Sunni Arab world perceived Iran, Shia Iran, as a great menace, and they saw Jewish Israel as an ally. And in fact, it was the only country that was effectively degrading Iran militarily by attacking its nuclear program, meaning its nuclear scientists, its revolutionary guards in Syria and in other places, its provision of weapons to Hezbollah via Syria and other channels, and so on and so forth. So this is what led to the Abraham Accords, because the Arab world understood that the only nation that was actually doing something about Iranian aggression in the region was Israel. Not even the United States, though they did some things, of course. They killed Soleimani, that was the head of the Al-Quds force of the Revolutionary Guards while he was in Iraq, and a few other things. But Israel was really taking the bait and doing the hard work, the dirty work, so to say, but necessary work against Iran in a very prominent clandestine undeclared war between Tehran and Jerusalem.
Well, but United States policy has fluctuated depending on whether the Democrats or the Republicans are in government, while Israel has, I mean, there must be a lot of discussion within Israel about many issues, but not about whether Israel has to really defend from Iran and its nuclear program.
Yes, indeed. This is an issue that crosses all party lines, basically. Now, when Hamas launched the October 7 attack, what they did was, in a way, breaking one of the premises of the Abraham Accords, because the Abraham Accords proved that Arab-Israeli normalization was possible even without a resolution of the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, very much like Egypt and Jordan had done with their own peace agreements. And Saudi Arabia was next. There was a lot of rumor, quite publicly, that Saudi Arabia could be signing on to the Oslo Accord, the Abraham Accords, or creating its own framework for a special accord between Mecca and Jerusalem, which would have been amazing in terms of our third circle of analysis, the Islamic-Israeli area, let's say. But this war actually had the specific intention of derailing that agreement and, of course, plunging the region again in a cycle of violence, blood, and death. And the whole narrative, the whole lexicon of peace was replaced by a lexicon of war and blood and death. Now, with the conclusion of this war, hopefully, both at the Gaza front, the Lebanese front, and even the Iranian front, maybe the chance of peace with Saudi Arabia will reemerge. Israel restored its deterrence vis-a-vis its enemies, and this led to a regaining of respect regionally. So maybe in a new reality, when we are having possibly a United States more assertive in its foreign policy, and Israel that is emerging victorious from this multi-front war and is currently hitting the Houthis in Yemen strongly. And maybe in a final confrontation with Iran, I don't know about that, but we'll see. Clearly, it is regaining the respect of the Arab world that up to the first anniversary of the October 7 war was perceiving Israel as being constrained politically and militarily and not being able to really extricate itself from the situation that Hamas had put it on. But now with Hezbollah basically degraded seriously, with Hamas decimated, with Syria no longer an ally of Iran, and with the air defenses of Iran totally exposed to Israeli airstrikes, I think that now Saudi Arabia may be reconsidering its cards.
Okay, Julian, it was a great conversation. Thank you very much, and we stay in touch.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Sebastian. I enjoyed very much talking to you.